Yes.
For making time for coming on to the program.
Thank you.
Go ahead, CEO. Karibu sana.
Thanks.
Right, there you go. Of course, it is the summit o'clock. Time for us to have that particular conversation that we always have every Wednesday night from 9 p.m. right here on Rwanda Television. Now listen, it is the summit, and all that we do right on the program is make this show one of the most interactive shows, a show that actually enables you to be able to be part of those key conversations that affect you in one way or another. As always, my name is Eugene Adnangwe. Tonight we have a conversation that is also very interesting, and we are trying to look at the hits and misses when it comes to the implementation of the AfCFTA. And of course we are joined by guests from here in studio, but also we have guests who are joining us all the way from outside of Rwanda. We have none other than David Hudein, who's actually an investigative journalist, who's joining us all the way in London. He's actually going to be coming to that particular screen any moment from now. There we have it. David, thank you so much for making time for joining us on the summit tonight. We're looking forward to having more insights from where you sit as a member of the Fourth Estate. Also with us right here in studio, I'm going to be sharing with you more details. I'm sure you know some of them. And what we were doing here, what we were saying earlier before we went on, we talked about government meeting private sector, and there was a joke that he's also private sector. So anyway, so we'll talk more about even the PPP, because this is what we are looking at in terms of the partnerships to implement the AfCFTA. Gentlemen, thank you so much for making time on the program. We have none other than Antoine Kajangwe, who's the Director General of Trade and Investment at the Ministry of Trade and Industry right in Rwanda. Thank you for making time.
Thank you for inviting
Also with us is none other than Stephen Ruzibiza, Chief Executive Officer of the Private Sector Federation. Thank you for making time, sir.
Pleasure.
And like I mentioned earlier on, we have none other than David, who's a journalist, and he's been following business-related journalists, unveiling or unraveling some of the findings when it comes to, a lot of issues from across the continent. I want us to talk a bit about this very important subject matter, and even the head of state of Rwanda did proclaim himself on the implementation phase or process of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. But if we look at this particular project, it's a huge one. When we talk about it on paper, when we talk about it from the vision itself, it portends or portrays a very promising future. However, its implementation seems to be receiving mixed reactions. There are those who are feeling that there is a level of frustration, a level of slowness in actually implementing this process. And I want to start with private sector. Just to understand, do you share in the same frustrations? Are you feeling that this implementation process is something that doesn't reflect what you see on the paper when it comes to AfCFTA?
Thank you, Anangwe. It is private sector again. When you're talking about CFTA implementation, it's more private sector taking the benefits of the CFTA. The slow pace in terms of implementation is felt across the board, be the government agencies, be the practitioners, the private sector, be the ordinary citizens. And comes in a way, the original or the initial target. What was it? CFTA, it's one of the agendas of the 2063 of AU. And this one of the projects, among the many projects. So the reason they started with this one, that means they wanted to improve the level of doing business and uplift the people from the poverty line. So to see or to assess its implementation success, one will have to look at the trade volumes. Have they increased ever since?
Have they?
Yes, to some extent.
To some extent.
To some extent. If we pick it from there, out of the 54 countries, I think, which have signed and committed to do something, 46 have ratified and signed the necessary protocols. If you look at the trade volumes between the 46 countries, at least there is a bit of improvement. The current, I think, it's around 1,209 USD billions, compared to before, it was signed and ratified, which was 1,505. So an increase of 54 billion US dollars is not bad. To that extent, yes, there is an improvement. But in other across the spectrum, there are still some challenges, which we believe should be, probably if I go a step back, after 2018, there came in COVID. So, and we had that J of 2 years or 3 years. But the question now is, what are the catch-up methods?
Catch-up methods, which we will actually go to. First of all, I want us to set the tone, set the agenda, if we all are in agreement or if we have different perceptions on this perceived slowness in implementation of AfCFTA. I'll come to David, but let me hear from Antoine. From where you sit at the Ministry of Trade and Industry right in Rwanda, you actually sit on the table in overseeing some of these implementation processes. I want you to just be honest with us. Maybe if there's some level of diplomacy, we'll actually put it on the side for a second or for a minute. Do you share in the same frustration of those who actually share the frustration of this thing started with a lot of good steam? Sure. We signed it and we all celebrated that finally we're going to have our own single market. We're not going to be depending on, imports and all that. But do you feel the same frustration as those who feel that this thing is not going in the same speed that we really wished it to be?
Thank you very much, Eugene, for the invitation to participate and certainly to be here with the private sector. I think for us is always a great pleasure to be able to share some of these updates. I don't share the same frustration, partly because we're, as you said, sitting on the table and seeing the progress and the movement. So we see the progress that is taking place. I think one of the things that we have to remember is that trade agreements by nature are a very complex agreement. And the AfCFTA, in a surprising approach, has actually taken a very quick time in comparison to other similar trade agreements to reach where we are today. And let me maybe just share a few numbers. The CEO has rightly mentioned that 54 out of 55 African Union countries have signed the AfCFTA. 47, and maybe just a slight correction there, 47 of 54 countries have ratified the agreement. 29 of the 54 countries have started to trade. And 42 countries of the 54 actually have what we refer to as tariff offers, verified tariff offers. And so all of this demonstrates to us that really from 2018 to 2023, that the willingness, the political willingness to trade is there. And the legal instruments that need to be put in place for us to start to trade are there. And I think this is what His Excellency the President was referring to when he said political commitment from leaders is important. And absolutely, I think in many ways it has been demonstrated, and it needs to continue to be demonstrated in a way to bring on board the private sector so that they can start trading. Now, as much as, and maybe this is where I can qualify my optimism slightly, is in twofold. One, the agreement as has been structured allows for a gradual liberalization or a gradual reduction of tariffs over a 10 to 15-year period for all products. And so we also have to keep that in mind, that because this is such a monumental agreement and because there's this progressive liberalization, it's also going to take us some time to see the full impact and the full effects of what the AfCFTA has to offer. I think that's a very critical aspect that sometimes we forget.
We overlook. This is what you feel?
Yes. Second, although the important thing is making sure that these instruments are in place and that we've started the drawdown. And indeed we have started it since 2021, January 2021. The second part, where I think it's also important for us to recognize, is that at the end of the day, trading happens from businesses, by businesses. And so it's important that we also prepare the businesses to be able to undertake all of the expectations that we've put to them, the private sector. But that also requires a lot of capacity building, it requires a lot of resources, it requires raising awareness advantage of it.
Yeah.
This is a process that can't happen overnight, but it's a journey that we have to continue to work with.
We'll come back to just probe some of those statements, and of course that statement where we are always told this is a journey that can't happen overnight. There are those who felt that usually sometimes is an excuse to tell us, guys, just hold on. The process is actually going to happen eventually. Let me bring in David. David, from where you sit, I mean, you've written extensively also on African issues, even when it comes to even the dollarization, which we'll touch on a bit. Yes, we want to trade as a continent, but what currency will we use under the AfCFTA? But talk to us a bit about what you hear when you put your ears on the ground, when you talk to traders, when you talk to different nationals. Are their expectations too high? Are they putting too much undue pressure on the implementers or the crafters of this ambitious agreement to a point that we now are terming it as slow pace in terms of its implementation? Or do you feel that they are justified in feeling that it is not moving at the speed they would expect it to move at?
So I'm going to do something unexpected and actually sort of maybe cut African political leaders a little bit of slack, which isn't something I tend to do. But I think that in this case, a lot of the problem stems from the fact that what exactly the AfCFTA is, unfortunately, has been somewhat oversold. There are certain expectations that several people, myself included, have been sort of conditioned to have about the AfCFTA, which on closer examination, it turns out that AfCFTA doesn't even promise those things. So as Antoine correctly mentioned, compared to free trade agreements of comparative size, such as the USMCA or Mercosur or even the Eurozone, the negotiations that brought AfCFTA to this point have been remarkably quick. However, the trade-off in exchange for that speed is that what exactly the AfCFTA is and will do, in many cases, is not properly nailed down or defined yet. So what I've come to understand over the past few months, for example, is that several countries who have already signed or ratified this agreement are still inserting several clauses, so several exemptions, several things that in the real sense of it could pretty much compromise what people's expectation of what the AfCFTA is with regard to individual sovereignty and customs union, common currencies, and all these sort of grand ideas that we have. So I feel as if the expectation on the ground, as heightened as it is, doesn't really match exactly what it is that the AfCFTA even promises to be. I think there's a communication problem between the policymakers and people on the ground. And I say this as one of the people on the ground. Up until relatively recently, I had a fundamentally sort of over-optimistic idea of what the AfCFTA was supposed to do. So I've discovered relatively recently, for example, like just over the past year, for example, that the very funding mechanism by which the AfCFTA will come into being, right, the funding mechanism that sustains the AU, only 16% of the AU's budget is actually internally funded. It's funded by AU member states. 73% of the AU's annual budget comes from outside of Africa. So the unavoidable consequence of that is that if policy decisions such as implementation of the AfCFTA, which we all broadly expect to be in Africa's economic interests, will not favor the economic interests of those who are actually funding this thing, then it's not going to happen the way we imagine it will. So these are sort of fundamental issues that haven't been bridged yet. The issues such as even the 16% that is supposed to be funded by AU member states, the successful collection rate is still hovering at around 80%. Right. There isn't even 100% collection rates for that $200 million total that AU member states are supposed to contribute. So these are fundamental issues which haven't been communicated and which I think are contributing to this sort of huge gulf between reality and expectation.
It's a very interesting perspective that you you think about this. And CEO, I'll start with you, but then I'll also come back to Antoine, just to demystify if there's any demystification that is needed on that particular aspect. CEO, you can't bite a finger that is actually feeding you. This is almost what David is alluding to, that look, you are putting up a tool that might not be in favor of those who are actually funding your operations. It's part of the AU's Agenda 2063, as you said. Do you feel that it might hit some headwinds from those who feel probably that is going to be a disadvantageous, platform for them when it comes to interests?
I want to assume one of the themes for CFTA is that Africa will want. Mm-hmm. And so I want to pick it from there. Meaning when you pick the theme Africa you want, that means there's Africa you have, mm-hmm. that you want to see progressing and you go to where you want.
Yes.
So the Africa we have is the Africa that is dominated by donors.
External funding.
And external funding, mm-hmm. external regulations, external monitoring and all that. Mm. So when they come up with CFTA, that is one tool of at least making sure that the Africa is self-sustained, mm-hmm. self-financed, mm-hmm. self-driven. Mm-hmm. So the issue that we are struggling with the donors and all external forces, that one will be there and has ever been there. Even in other markets, if you go to Asia market, the common market, if you go to EU, they have external forces that they are dealing with. Yeah. They could be of minimal impact, but they are there. The question is, shouldn't be the external forces per se, but the question should be the political will to fight and
the external forces,
and see that you achieve your goals. So the purpose, I think, that as of today is, I like the topic, hits and misses. Mm-hmm. So we have a target, what have we achieved, mm-hmm. and what have we missed, so that we can correct it, to see that we fed off the constraints, the challenges that we are having.
Interesting. Antoine, you tell us, I mean, is this something that you envisioned, even as you discussed the implementation process, as part of what you target to hit in terms of, maneuvering around? Or how do we see it as a potential threat that could, potentially miss the target of AfCFTA, as David said?
Sure. I think the CEO has said it really well, which is we have to think about this from an African agency perspective. It can't be what other trading partners might feel and might do to undermine the process.
That's a reality. We cannot hide our heads in the sand.
True, but it's also important that we also take ownership of the process. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what many governments across the continent are doing. It's what the private sector is also doing, ensuring that we make the most of what this agreement has to offer. Mm. And we can talk about all of the agreements and protocols that have been concluded and the number of ratifications, which is an important, I think, hit. Where we're missing, and I think David alluded to this, which is precisely where perhaps a lot of the frustration is coming from, is that despite having these ratifications, despite having these tariff offers, the trading isn't happening. And part of it is because, or isn't happening as fast and as frequent as it should. Partly because we still need to implement some of the various things at a national level. So I can give you an example. Certificates of origin, for instance, under the AfCFTA. This is just a document that notes that your product is originating in a country and therefore should benefit from these preferential treatment. In Rwanda, we offer that certificate at customs. A number of other countries offer that.
But others don't.
Others don't. Yeah. And that's where...
And you expect to move in the same speed.
Absolutely. And that's where we need to work together to ensure that we're all pulling towards the same goal, which is ensuring that we don't just end at the signing. The political will now needs to go into the implementation and ensuring that what we have signed, the commitments that we have made, now start to become implemented and start to actually get utilized by the private sector. And we're on that process as well.
When you sit in those meetings to implement this, and I want to hear also Stephen from private sector, also if you are part of the table discussions or you are the people who are just told this is what we discussed, now go implement. When you sit in these meetings, how do you work on dealing with this sovereignty issue? Because even the president alluded to it, the fact that we are still having headwinds because some of the countries are still worried about losing their sovereignty. We also spoke, or you've spoken about the aspect of owning the process as those who signed. But we're already seeing individual African countries going ahead to even enter into individualistic kind of partnerships with other countries. Specific example in Kenya, just the other day, Kenya went ahead and signed with the European Union. And of course, this is even coming at a time when East Africa was working on a common signing on the EU EPA. You know, I mean, how do you explain this to someone who feels that we could be heading the wrong direction?
So maybe I won't refer to the EU Kenya EPA in this program, and maybe we'll have another occasion for this. But
the fact of working, you know, in silos like that.
I think part of it is also ensuring that countries are willing and ready to implement what they have committed to. That's the first process, and that's really a very important process. The political willingness to actually say, we've signed, we've ratified, and now we must implement. That's first, which I think at every country's national leadership and national process has to undertake. The second, which is a legal instrument, is what we refer to as the dispute settlement mechanism under the AfCFTA. And that is the enforcement arm of the agreement, to essentially say, look, if Rwanda has agreed to reduce its tariff, if Kenya has agreed to reduce its tariff, if Ghana, South Africa, and so on and so forth, then you're obligated to do so. And if you don't, then there are repercussions and retaliations to not implementing those commitments. Now, we haven't gotten to the stage where countries start to apply those enforcement mechanisms, but the important thing is that that instrument and that tool is there to really ensure that, hey, we didn't just commit on paper, but there's actually now a mechanism to enforce what we've committed. And I imagine that is going to be a very strong incentive for governments and the private sector to actually start to operate.
Right. And you mentioned private sector starting to operate. I mean, Steve?
I wouldn't be having a problem or an issue if the silos involvement, side deals are being made, as long as they complement the big picture.
Do you think the Kenya situation complements the big picture?
Now, don't put me on the spot.
These are the realities. You know, this reality versus what we wish or what we expect to see.
But if they are done over time, if we are putting much effort and much power, much dedication, finance into silo activities, then CFTA will end up being a paper tiger. Because we are going to work in silos, we are going to work in sets. And in terms of definition, we remain with the geographical sovereignty.
And population.
And population, but we shall not have the targeted jobs. We shall not have the industrialization aspect. And we shall not have the competitive aspect, which is one of the key pillars of the CFTA. So that doesn't mean you can't have bilateral relations. Kenya is free to do bilateral negotiations wherever, as long as what the country is getting from bilateral relations is coming to expand on the big objectives of CFTA. Because at the end of the day, we remain an Africa, whether you want it or not. And you're going to trade within the African continent. So when the CFTA wasn't on the table on the drafting and the initiators of CFTA, but I imagine one of the reasons they brought on the CFTA is that the continuous failure of the continent to come at the same par with the fellow continents. And one of that was that they have been working in groups for a given period. Not consistently. We have so many economic regional blocks where 2 or 3 more countries are member of, and it has never worked. So when they thought of coming up with one big block, probably was to remove those kind of groups that are not serving at the end of the day the people.
I see. But David, if you're still with us, I want to hear your thoughts on this, especially on the aspect that Antoine also alluded to, the fact that there is the implementation or enforcement arm that could actually put out a carrot or a stick to those who are actually not, living by the rules. However, you and I know that we have had scenarios where there are rules which have always been flaunted, but nothing has ever happened. For example, even the contribution to the membership for the African Union, we have countries that have not been at par in payment over time. And part of the rules, even allow the Secretariat to even, put them out of the African Union. But we have never seen such happen. We're talking about even non-tariff barriers within the East African community itself. We still have countries that are imposing visa restrictions. We have had just the other day South Sudan, with other countries and all that. How then do you think this would either stand out as a hit or a miss for the implementation process of the AfCFTA?
So I think it's going to be very interesting to see exactly how the AU will the stick, as you put it, because so coming from a Nigerian context, over the past 3 to 4 years, we've seen practical examples of what happens when even within an existing, supposedly what is supposed to be an existing free trade area, the ECOWAS region of West Africa, we've seen Nigeria use a unilateral border closure as a sort of blunt force instrument of policy enforcement, something which is not supposed to happen under the existing rules of ECOWAS. So where you have a situation where even within the tinier trading bloc, certain influential AU member states are already flouting these rules. What mechanism does the AU have to ensure that if they flout these rules within the AfCFTA, that there will be some sort of repercussions for doing so? It will be very interesting to see what that is, because based on what I see, it seems to me very much as if the politicians who are in charge of pushing the AfCFTA agenda, at least from my perspective in West Africa, I'm not so sure whether it's the same in East Africa, but in West Africa, it's spoken of almost as a nice to have, not as a need to have. So the reality that Africa is always going to be poor if we don't dramatically accelerate our rate of intra-regional trade, that really doesn't seem to have sort of percolated the political consciousness in West Africa yet. There is still very much that sort of hyper-nationalistic sort of siloed mentality within the political class on that part of the continent. So, where you have a part of the continent which, Nigeria on its own has $500 billion economy, which would be a massive market for the rest of the AfCFTA. But then you have that country is sort of, whenever it wakes up on the wrong side of the bed, it sort of locks its borders. Yeah. To trade and to movement, which is just like unthinkable, right? But that happens regularly. So what exactly is the AU going to do about it? I get the impression that and I think Antoine already referenced this as well, different regions of Africa are moving at dramatically different paces in terms of what their vision for enforcement of the AfCFTA and implementation of the AfCFTA will look like. I think on my part of the continent, we're a good 10, 15 years behind where we should be. I don't think, I'm struggling to see what teeth the AU has to actually make this happen. If players like Nigeria and Ghana simply, decide not to follow the rules, because it's been the case pretty much since independence that even though, supposedly these rules have existed within the ECOWAS region, these rules have been flouted multiple times. So I'm focusing on Nigeria and Ghana here because those are like my two areas of specialty. Those are two countries which, in living memory, have both conducted large-scale expulsion of each other's citizens within what is supposed to be a free trade zone. Right?
Interesting.
And there were no repercussions for this. So I I'll be really interested in seeing what exactly the AU intends to do about this. Especially given that these are countries which, at least in terms of paying for their membership dues, there's been a high level of compliance with them. So these aren't countries that you can sort of toss aside. So what exactly is the AU going to do? Honestly, I'm struggling to see it. From my point of view, I just don't see it yet.
Yeah. We would have known. I'd invited the African Union Commission. I've also tried to invite the Secretariat for the AfCFTA, but at least we have Antoine here because they both were not able to make it to the program. This is actually week number 4, trying to have them on this particular platform. But regardless of that, the show must continue. Antoine, you wanted to intervene on that, especially on how. Look, Rwanda can say we will follow all the rules, but Rwanda, out of the other African countries, cannot do it on its own. I mean, how do you now bring in that issue of enforcement, that we all agreed to this and you are not doing it as we agreed? What are you bringing on the table in terms of your voice as Rwanda on this?
No, and really thank you for David for raising this, because I think this is really where the crux of the problem is.
Yes.
How do you ensure that countries at varying degrees of development, of varying degrees of implementation of agreements, all play at the same level across the continent? Following rules, trade rules, I think is one of the most challenging policy areas, not even just in East Africa or on the continent, but globally. I mean, under the WTO today, we're seeing a retreating of globalization. We're seeing export restrictions being put in place, partly as a response to COVID-19 and global insecurity issues. But I think this is where the AfCFTA also offers an opportunity for us to follow the rules. Primarily because this is the first time you have East working with West, working with South, working with Central. So the best practice, the idea and the ambition of the AfCFTA is that we can borrow best practices from each other.
If we want to or if we don't want to.
Absolutely. But I think today, and the perspective of the government of Rwanda, and certainly where we're sitting, is that there is as much need to be as optimistic as possible, because this has never been done before. There is no single agreement besides the African Union organization where you have countries coming together across the continent. Again, 54 out of 55 countries have signed this agreement. 47 have ratified this. This has never been heard of in the history of Africa.
So, fine, but we have never had it, we've done it, then what? Because that's the part which is actually the cookie crumbles, right?
Absolutely, and we're doing it. And I think that's maybe the message that we need to take home, is that we're doing it. There's need to fast track it, and there's need to be innovative about how we fast track it. Now, there is the enforcement aspect, and you raised it very well, which is what we would call the carrot, or sorry, the stick.
The stick.
Now, the carrot needs to now be, how do we incentivize the private sector to lead this charge? Because the legal instruments that governments can put in place are there. But now, who is actually going to use them? It's the private sector. And we need the private sector to put that pressure on governments, both at the national level, but also with our trading partners, to say, we want you to start to trade.
Steve, the pressure you guys are putting at PSF is not enough. It just feels you need to put more pressure, because if you don't, then the luxury will be there. But before you even answer, Pro, I want to hear your point, especially on the involvement of private sector, because we have aspects or stages of involvement. At what point do you feel the voice of the private sector has also been crucial and even being heard? Is it even being heard in this case? What is it that you as private sector want that you consider have been misses in the AfCFTA implementation that you'd like fixed to become a hit?
Let's work in an organized way. When you talk about the involvement of private sector, at what level, what stage do you bring private sector on level, and who initiates the involvement? Is it the individual governments? Is it the AU? Is it the CFTA Secretariat? So, because each of those have a part to play in the success and implementation of CFTA. So, if at the big global perspective, I would want to see EU taking the lead to involve private sector. Because
EU or EU?
EU, African Union.
African Union, yes, yes.
Because CFTA is, as I said, it's one of the flagships of the Agenda 2063.
Yes.
So African Union should be taking the lead to influence all that is happening. And that takes us to who has the mandate and the role to implement and see that the primary objective of CFTA is achieved. We have over 47 countries that have ratified. And basically, when you look at the paper setup, everything is ready to start and operate. But do you want to tell me each country is going to monitor the neighbor? So again, this takes us back. Who has the role, or who should have the responsibility to drive all this?
In your opinion, who?
It should be CFTA together with AU, because CFTA came out as a flagship of AU, African Union. So we should be seeing AU at the forefront, putting every member state on forefront. Account, you signed. So was it to make a political statement because you have a political mandate?
Yeah.
And so that you are elected to the next term. So those are the things which we should be seeing, and we want the states not to sign, as I call them, paper tiger, so that they are there and you archive them.
Yeah.
And that is the end. So I believe and African Union has a number of commissions, including the commission, I think, in charge of economics and all that.
Yes.
So being in economics, we are talking about CFTA.
Yes.
And the rest will follow. So the African leaders, they have political mandate. They will go, but the agreement will stay.
Yeah.
The African Union will stay.
Yeah.
We have, ever since AU was established, we have had presidents leave office, that we have seen AU still in the existence. So they should be taking the lead. And that will take away the question of we are the different level of development, we are the different level of...
So at what point then does private sector come?
Now, that is the biggest question. We should have come on the table during the initiation of the...
From day one?
Day one.
So since you're left out, let them continue.
Not
Is that
really,
what you're saying?
Not really, but that shows you the willingness. See, you're talking about creating a common market for the private sector operators, and they are not on the table. If you take the Asian common market, once they started, they created the Chamber of Commerce. And the heads of state of each member state would select 3 people from each member state to sit at the secretariat as advisors. Here we don't see it happening, so that they contribute. But at the national levels we have, because I think they have what is called national implementation committees, where it is either chaired by the Minister of Trade or whoever is selected. And that's when the private sector are involved for consultants purposes, by the way.
Consultancy?
Yes, they are consulting you.
So you feel this was already a misfiring because of the way it began? Let
me give you a joke. When they were signing and ratifying, I think it is the public officers that got a visa, something free.
Nothing, no one from private sector?
No. And when they are moving with their policy papers, not briefcase of money or business ideas. That shows you
So that was the false start?
Not
the
really.
Miss at that level?
When you realize that you missed something, you correct it. But at this stage, when should we bring the private sector? They should be on the table. I was trying to go through the structures of the secretariat to see if they have a chamber of commerce. It is not there. You have the summit, the Council of Ministers and all that, but you don't have an arm that is voicing the opinion of private sector. You will have it as a group of people trying to create their relevancy, but it is not driven by the policy, by the political will of the member states.
Right, and that's a very interesting point, because you've mentioned that politicians will come and go, their mandates will come and go. Private sector normally actually stays. And if indeed there was that misfiring at that particular point in the beginning, maybe Antoine, you can help us to clarify on this. Was this thing really tailored to have the private sector at the core of the chassis or the engine of this thing, or are you just saying they need to push or exert pressure on politicians when they were not even involved at the first place? How do they come in?
So I would maybe qualify this slightly by saying private sector is certainly involved in the process. Could they be involved more? Could they be engaged even at a deeper level, I think what CEO has said is very correct. There is no institutional structure within the AfCFTA.
Why would it be that way then? And we're saying private sector should take the lead on it.
Partly for two reasons. I would say one, because this at the end of the day is a framework agreement that touches on laws, which need to be addressed by governments, right? So every time we talk about protocols, tariff reductions, things like that, these are things that have to be handled.
But the private sector will be affected as they do business.
Absolutely.
So if they were not part of the table, then the lawmakers are creating laws for who?
So they're there at a national level, and I think the CEO said it rightly, which is that at the national level, we've consulted with private sector extensively. And this is true for every individual country and also at a regional level. If we're talking about tariff reduction or opening of certain services sectors, at the end of the day, it's not government that will trade.
Correct.
Or that will benefit from these opening up of markets. It will be the private sector. And so that I think is where it needs to be understood that at some point government needs to pave the way and then private sector needs to follow.
Do you feel, would you say that this is a miss in the framework of the AfCFTA, if indeed what CEO of Private Sector Federation says is anything to go by?
I don't think so, because I think there's still engagement of the private sector. I think what we're seeing today is that there's now a shift in gears, right? A shift from government to private sector, of almost saying, okay, government has now done the legal reforms that need to be done. All of the instruments that need to be put in place.
Yeah.
Now who trades? Once those instruments are in place, who does it benefit? In consultation with the private sector.
Consultation.
And now it needs to be the private sector to then take it on. And that's where we are today. And let me maybe just provide two examples that we're doing at a national level. He's mentioned the National Implementation Committee, which has really helped to allow Rwanda to implement as fast as it's done. What we've done of recent is now looking at how do we help the private sector to benefit. One was working with Rwanda to put in place a preferential tariff rate for the private sector. Whereas you would normally be charged $1.8 per kilo to transport your goods to Europe or elsewhere, under the AfCFTA it's $1.4. It's actually $1 if you're exporting anything above a ton. Right? So these are practical mechanisms that are there to incentivize the private sector to say, okay, the instruments are there. Now, how do you take advantage of them? Right? NTB reporting mechanism, I think, is also very important. The tool is there. So how do we also start to get it utilized to be able to now start to know which country is not abiding by their obligations. And that's where there has to be close collaboration, even closer collaboration with the private sector.
David, I want to hear your take on this, and then we'll quickly read some of the feedback that is coming in thick and fast on our social media platforms. David, is it a scenario of putting the cart ahead of the horse, especially when now the private sector is being called to, engage or be part of the implementation of the AfCFTA? Is that a miss or a hit for you? Because CEO of Private Sector Federation here in Rwanda says, look, even within the framework of the African Union Commission, the AfCFTA, the private sector voice is almost non-existent. What is your take on this? How do you read this?
So I think it's a symptom of the sort of statism that has plagued Africa for half a century or so, where we believe that the state is the primary force that must direct everything. I think he was right that the private sector should have been involved from day zero. They should have been involved in drafting the AfCFTA, and at every level of the signing and implementation process, they should have been integral to it. That's how it's been done everywhere else. But having said that, as there's a Chinese saying that says the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, the second best time is today. So for whatever reason, the private sector wasn't brought in when it should have been brought in, but it's been brought in, or we're having this conversation now. Yeah. So at least the realization is there now that without the private sector driving this thing, it's not going to work, because it's not the government that trades, it's regular people, it's private people in the private sector who do it. So as long as this realization permeates through African political consciousness, I don't think it's a miss. Yeah, I don't think that'll be a fair characterization. Something can be called a miss until after it's been seen to have failed. It hasn't even been fully implemented yet, so we can't make that judgment. However, what I will say is that over and beyond the specific conversation about private sector involvement, I think a wider issue that will need to be addressed is the fact that AfCFTA implementation and just general AU cohesion in general needs to be an issue that transcends the sort of flavor of the month politics in individual African nations. And what I mean by that is the idea that Africa needs to converge and needs to open up to itself needs to be something which is fundamental to the national doctrine of all AU member states. It isn't something that should just be a case of, okay, there's a president or there's a prime minister in power who is well disposed toward this, so we go sign whatever agreements we go sign now, and then 5 years later he's no longer in power, we voted someone else in, and then that person maybe is sort of anti this, and then implementation becomes an issue. I think that's definitely a worry. From the sort of limited observation that I've made of the EU and the Eurozone specifically, it's the case that it's almost as if the politicians are just sort of the final layer on top. The real sort of institutional power rests within the civil service. I think that's how it should be in Africa. I think there's too much that is dependent
on the politician,
the specific ideology of whoever is in power right now. And that is an existential threat to the implementation of the AfCFTA. So I think the AU needs to, I mean, there's probably some commission or the other that deals with this, but I think this needs to be something that should be looked at with some level of urgency within the AU, that this needs to be institutionalized within the very civil service structure of every country. So it's just that it's not just dependent on the political will at any given point in time.
I think that would be one of the areas or solutions to the issue of political will, because it now moves away from just your will as a politician to an institutionalized agenda that you actually have to actually go by. I want us to just take a few minutes and read some of the feedback, the comments, and you can also share your thoughts on what you've heard so far since we started this particular conversation tonight right here on the summit. The hashtag to use, as always, is the summit RW. You can tweet me directly at Eugene Anangwe or at RBA Rwanda. We'll be able to read your thoughts, or you can also go on our live stream on YouTube and leave your question right there, leave your comment right there on YouTube, like we are there right now. I'll be reading some of them. Let me just start off with this one from Dolapo Aina, a good friend of the show. Says valid points by Eugene and David. After discussing with business players on the African continent who have ventures into AfCFTA trade, you wonder if it is a dream or reality. The elephant in the room, some big economies are not willing, a reality. And there are those who are feeling like they're the big players within the African economies, and they're not willing to, go down to the level of others under the AfCFTA. I have another comment right here from Mpame Rodney, who says, can the panelists first help us to understand what the regional blocs helped Africans of the respective members? The regional blocs, how did they help, first of all? Then from there we can predict the feasibility of AfCFTA. I think this is also a very interesting one right there. Let me go quickly to YouTube before we go back there. So Tom says they have looked at the intellectual property issues with the protocols, and they are wondering how they will impact on health and how they will actually be protected within the AfCFTA. Maybe let's quickly deal with some of those questions. Antoine, I'll start off with you on the area of bigger economies feeling this is too little for us to actually stoop too low to commit to.
Sure. I would actually say, I think one of the biggest benefits of the AfCFTA is that it's bringing these big economies, and that they're opening up their markets. I mean, we talk about Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt. These are economies that are essentially part of the 47 countries that are able to now start to trade. Egypt participated in the Guided Trade Initiative, which allowed us to test the functionality of the agreement.
Yeah.
South Africa, together with SACU, has opened up their market to the rest of the continent.
Yeah.
Similarly with Nigeria as well. So I think what we've seen is that there is, again, an unprecedented push by countries at all levels really to open up. I think one thing that we also forget around implementation is that implementation by itself, or rather of the instruments by itself, is not enough. We also need other elements that support implementation, specifically logistics, right? And free movement of people and a number of other elements. Today, if you want to trade with, let me give an example, Niger, right? Infrastructure and the right logistical infrastructure to be able to trade on the continent. And those are sizable capital investments that are going to take some time.
Right.
But I think the big economies are demonstrating that they're open to trading, but time will tell to what level, and I think this is maybe where some of the frustration is coming. To what level are they really open to the long run?
Correct. CEO.
On the question of the bigger
Economies.
players, yes, they are big in some sectors, but they are short in other sectors. Allow me to give you just one example. Botswana is doing well in terms of economic performance, and they are very good in beef sector, but they are short in animal that are necessary for this beef sector. Kenya is the best if I pick in the region in terms of farming. So I wouldn't see how Botswana, who is good in the beef sector, not benefiting from the animal resource and husbandry from the neighboring countries. If you go to Morocco, they are very good in the pharmacy sector.
Yes.
But they need inputs from other countries. So other than looking at where you're strong, but of course there is where you are weak. Yeah. And where that weak point starts from,
you can tap into the other.
You can tap in,
African
and that's where
country.
you're going to find.
Interesting. We need a visa on arrival or visa-free across Africa for the full implementation of AfCFTA. This will facilitate the free movement of. I did ask this question even the other day when the president of Zambia was here. Right now is visa on arrival. Can we have visa-free? And I think the answer was even visa-free is a big step. A lot of things are involved down there. But this is a very valid point from Dushime, who's actually saying that we need this.
See, the success of CFTA will depend on free movement of people.
Correct.
When people move, you move with everything.
Yeah.
You move with capital, you move with skills, you move with everything, as long as you're free to move. And you can't freely move if you have conditions that you have to first abide by. There is no point of a person just across the border to require a visa to move 10 meters away from his area of residence. That's why you have these shortcuts, because you are giving conditions. So the free movement of goods, the free movement of capital, free will succeed if the people, individuals can freely move.
Yeah.
I agree 100% that free visa is a must.
Right. I'll read one last comment and then we'll all take our closing remarks as we go. Rutai Sire is saying thanks for touching on the AfCFTA. I will have to mention that the governments have done their part. Question is, how much does someone lose if not using AfCFTA certificate of origin for countries already in COMESA like Egypt? This is an interesting one. What would you say just quickly?
Absolutely, and I think that's been one of the interesting things about this experiment, is maybe this overlapping and spaghetti bowl of agreements that overlap. Today, if you're a trader in Rwanda, you can continue to trade under COMESA rules because those have been under implementation for a long time. Private sector is aware of them, and to the extent that you receive the same preferential treatment that you would under the AfCFTA. So the AfCFTA comes to provide the market access to other regions and other markets where Rwanda hasn't been trading, specifically Central, West, and Southern Africa. And so we can continue to use these different certificates of origin. The AfCFTA allows for this. And so I would advise really whatever is convenient. For the time being, those certificates of origin are still in effect.
Right. David, I'll start with you. Just real quick, what is your takeaway? Are you optimistic? Are you going to see more hits? than misses in the implementation stage, just in under, let's say, 30 seconds?
I am optimistic, and the reason I'm optimistic is really because Africa doesn't have any other choice. There's no other game in town. There's no other set of trading partners that we're going to find that are as easily accessible and have the political will or desire to trade with us. So, I mean, historically, wherever Africa doesn't have a choice but to do something, it always finds a way.
Thank you so much, David, for that. CEO, Stephen, just in another 30 seconds.
We have no alternative, as David has said.
Yeah.
At the university, there was a hall which had the slogan, we either win or they lose. So we either go through and succeed, or we succeed.
So success is the only option.
Yes,
Antoine, in your closing remarks.
I couldn't agree more. I think we have to be optimistic.
Yeah.
Our future depends on us being able to trade
Yeah.
with each other.
Yeah.
And I think there's this vibrancy on the continent that it's Africa's century.
Yeah.
And the AfCFTA is the beginning of this.
Right. This is an opportunity we should not lose. But real quick, I'll read your comment. You said another element which will help private sector is to put focus on mutual recognition agreement. This will avoid duplication on complying with standards of each country. A very pertinent point that actually brings us to the end of the show here in this four walls. Like we always say on the program, the conversation doesn't end here. It continues on our social media platforms. We are across the board on Twitter at Eugene Anangwe. You can tweet us, and the hashtag to use as always is the Summit RW. We'll see you again next week. Hopefully we'll talk about the aspect of the debate around the de-dollarization or not to de-dollarize and the process around it. We're still trying to convince the big players who are in this space to join us on the summit, and we hope that they'll be able to listen to our calls and join us to have this very important conversation. As always, my name is Eugene Anangwe. Goodbye for now.